The church doors had barely closed when the whispers began. Evelina Marsh stood at the altar in a gown that did not belong to her, in a chapel filled with people who did not want her there, marrying a man who would not look at her. She heard the words before the priest even finished speaking them. A voice from the second row, not even lowered, said the bride had trapped him. Another voice agreed, calling it a shameful match, a debt paid in flesh instead of coin. Evelina kept her chin high and her eyes fixed on the small gold cross above the altar, because if she looked anywhere else, she thought she might break in front of all of them. Beside her stood Julian Ashworth, Duke of Ashbourne, tall and unreadable, his jaw set like stone. He had not smiled once since she arrived. He had not spoken a single word to her beyond what the ceremony required. When the priest asked if he would take Evelina to be his wife, he answered with a flat, quiet yes. The kind of yes a man gives when agreeing to a business contract, not a marriage. Evelina had known, of course, that this was not a match born of love. Her father, Baron Marsh, had gambled away nearly everything the family owned, and the debts had grown too large and too public to hide. When the Duke of Ashbourne offered to marry her in exchange for settling those debts and quietly protecting the family name, her father had accepted before Evelina was even asked her opinion. She had been given 2 weeks to prepare for a wedding to a man she had spoken to exactly once, for perhaps 10 minutes, in a drawing room full of solicitors and papers. Now here she was, a duchess in name only, standing beside a husband who treated her like an unwelcome guest in his own wedding. The ceremony ended. The priest pronounced them husband and wife. Julian did not kiss her, only offered his arm, stiff and formal, and led her down the aisle past a sea of curious, judging faces. Evelina heard her name mixed with cruel words all the way to the doors. A woman near the back murmured that the Marsh girl had finally caught herself a fortune. Another laughed, low and sharp, and said the Duke deserved better than a bride with a ruined father and an empty purse. Evelina did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry, not here, not in front of these people who had decided who she was before she ever spoke a word to them. The wedding breakfast that followed was no kinder. She sat at the head table beside her new husband, watching him greet guest after guest with the same distant courtesy, never once turning to include her in a conversation, never once resting his hand near hers. She smiled until her face ached. She answered every polite, poisonous question about her father's debts and her family's disgrace with as much grace as she could manage. She thanked people for wishing her well, when their eyes said the opposite. By the time the guests began to leave, Evelina felt as though she had run a great distance without moving an inch. It was evening when the carriage finally delivered them to Ashbourne House. The building rose from the darkness like something out of a story, grand and cold, with high windows and iron gates that seemed built to keep people out rather than welcome them in. Servants lined the entrance hall to greet their new duchess, but their bows were shallow, their eyes curious rather than warm. Evelina understood immediately that news of the wedding, and the whispers that came with it, had already reached the household staff. Julian said very little as he led her through the halls, pointing out rooms with the detachment of a man giving a tour to a stranger, rather than showing his wife her new home. When they reached the family wing, he stopped outside a set of doors and told her, without any softness in his voice, that this would be her chamber. His own rooms, he said, were at the opposite end of the corridor. Evelina understood the message clearly enough. This marriage would exist on paper and nowhere else. Still, some foolish part of her hoped he might say something more. A word of comfort, perhaps, or even an apology for the ordeal of the day. Instead, Julian looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable, and said only that he hoped she would find the house comfortable in time. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the long corridor until they faded completely. Evelina stood alone outside her new bedroom door in her wedding gown, in a house full of strangers, married to a man who had already made it clear he wanted nothing from her but an heir and a signature. She let herself into the chamber and closed the door softly behind her. The room was beautiful, filled with fine furniture and soft candlelight, everything a young bride could want, except the one thing that mattered most. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed, alone, and finally allowed herself 3 quiet tears, no more. She wiped them away quickly, angry with herself for even that much weakness. She thought of her father, asleep somewhere in his modest townhouse, likely relieved that his debts were finally settled, and his family name spared from ruin. She thought of her mother, who had died 3 years earlier and never had to see her daughter sold into a marriage like a piece of property. She thought of the whispers in the church, the laughter at the breakfast, the cold distance in her husband's eyes. Evelina had always believed she would marry for something more than convenience. She had imagined, foolishly perhaps, A husband who would look at her the way her father used to look at her mother, with warmth and quiet devotion. Instead, she had a husband who could not be bothered to walk her fully to her door. But Evelina Marsh, now Evelina Ashworth, Duchess of Ashbourne, was not a woman who broke easily. She had survived her father's ruin, the loss of her mother, and a wedding day designed to humiliate her, and she had done it all without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. She would survive this too. She rose from the bed, walked to the window, and looked out over the dark gardens below. Somewhere out there, beyond the gates and the hedges, the whole of London was likely still gossiping about the wedding of the season, mocking the bride who had trapped a duke, pitying the duke who had been forced into disgrace. Let them talk, she thought. Let them say whatever cruel things they wished. She would not give them the reaction they wanted. A soft knock came at the door. For one unreasonable moment, Evelina's heart lifted, thinking perhaps Julian had returned to say something kinder, something that might make the night easier to bear. But when she opened the door, it was only a maid, a young woman with tired eyes and a nervous smile, come to help her out of her wedding gown for the night. The maid, whose name was Grace, worked quietly and quickly, saying almost nothing beyond what was necessary. But just before she left, she paused at the door and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she was sorry for how unkind the day had been to her. It was a small thing, a few simple words from a servant girl who had no reason to offer any comfort at all. But it was the first kindness Evelina had been shown since the carriage arrived at the church that morning. Evelina thanked her softly, and Grace slipped out, leaving her alone once more. She changed into her nightclothes and climbed into the enormous, cold bed by herself. Somewhere down the corridor, behind a door she did not dare approach, her husband slept, or did not sleep, in a room that felt 1,000 miles away. Evelina stared up at the dark ceiling for a long while, replaying the events of the day, the whispers, the laughter, the cold formality of the ceremony, the empty space beside her at dinner, though he had physically sat there, the short, distant goodnight outside her door. She thought about the years ahead, stretching out before her like a long gray road with no clear end, a marriage without warmth, a house full of strangers, a husband who saw her as an obligation rather than a wife. It would have been easy to let despair take hold of her that night. Instead, Evelina made herself a quiet promise as she finally drifted toward sleep. She would not let this house, or this marriage, or the cruel whispers of society break her spirit. She had entered this arrangement with her dignity intact, and no matter what came next, she intended to keep it that way. Whatever kind of man Julian Ashworth truly was beneath that cold, distant exterior, she did not yet know, but she was determined to find out, on her own terms, in her own time, without begging for his attention or his affection. The candle beside her bed burned low and finally went out, leaving the room in darkness. Outside, the city carried on with its gossip and its judgment, entirely unaware that inside the walls of Ashbourne House, a new duchess had just made a silent vow to survive whatever came next, no matter how cold the house, or how distant the man she had married. She thought back to the moment the carriage had pulled away from the church steps, how she had glanced through the small window and caught sight of her father standing alone near the entrance, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the ground rather than on his daughter's departure. He had not even waved. Perhaps he could not bear to watch what his choices had cost her. Perhaps he simply did not know what to say. Either way, Evelina had watched him grow smaller and smaller through the window, until the carriage turned a corner, and he disappeared from view entirely, and she had felt, in that moment, more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She wondered too about Julian, and what thoughts occupied his mind as he sat in his own chamber down the long corridor. Did he feel any of the same weight she carried tonight? Or was he simply relieved that the public spectacle of the wedding was finally behind him, free now to return to whatever quiet, orderly life he had lived before a stranger's debts forced her into his household? She could not begin to guess at the answer, not yet. She barely knew the man at all, beyond his title, his cold gray eyes, and the flat, formal tone he used whenever he spoke to her. There had been one moment, brief and easy to miss, when something in his expression had shifted. It happened just after the vows, when the priest pronounced them married, and a ripple of muted laughter passed through the guests. For half a second, Julian's jaw had tightened, and something like anger, or perhaps embarrassment, had flickered across his face before he smoothed it away again. Evelina had almost missed it. She found herself wondering now, lying alone in the dark, whether that flicker of feeling had been anger at her, or anger on her behalf. She did not know him well enough yet to say. The house settled into a deep quiet around her, the kind of silence found only in very large homes late at night, when when servants have retired and the walls seem to hold their breath. Somewhere far below, a clock struck the hour, its chime rolling faintly through the corridors before fading into nothing. Evelina counted the strikes without meaning to, an old habit from childhood, and let the sound anchor her thoughts until they grew slower, heavier, less sharp with grief and more simply tired. She would rise tomorrow as the Duchess of Ashbourne, whether she felt ready for that role or not. She would walk through this unfamiliar house, meet the members of staff she had not yet been introduced to, and begin the long, uncertain work of building some kind of life within these cold walls. Whatever waited for her beyond tonight, she would face it the same way she had faced today, with her back straight and her expression calm, refusing to let anyone see how deeply the day had wounded her. Her first night as Duchess of Ashbourne ended in silence, in a bed built for two but occupied by one, in a house that did not yet feel like home, and might never feel that way at all. A teacup shattered against the floor before Evelina had even finished her first week at Ashbourne House. It was not her fault, though the Dowager Duchess seemed determined to suggest otherwise. Margaret Ashworth, Julian's mother, had summoned Evelina to the morning room under the pretense of discussing household matters, only to spend the better part of an hour listing everything Evelina was doing wrong. Her posture was too stiff. Her accent, though proper, lacked the right warmth for a duchess. Her gowns, though new, still carried the unmistakable air of a family recently fallen from grace. When Evelina, exhausted from the criticism, reached for her teacup with a trembling hand, it slipped and shattered against the polished floor. Margaret did not offer comfort. She simply looked at the broken pieces, then at Evelina, and said quietly that she hoped her son had not made a terrible mistake. Evelina apologized, gathered herself, and left the room with as much dignity as she could manage, though her hands did not stop shaking until she reached the privacy of her own chamber. The days that followed settled into an uncomfortable rhythm. Julian left early each morning for matters of business and returned late, often after Evelina had already retired. When they did share meals, the conversation rarely extended beyond polite, empty exchanges about the weather or the household accounts. He was never unkind to her, not exactly, but his distance was its own kind of wound, a constant reminder that she remained a stranger in her own home. The servants, too, kept their distance. Some were simply shy, unsure how to behave around a new mistress who had arrived under such public scrutiny. Others, Evelina suspected, had absorbed some of the dowager's disapproval and treated her accordingly, with correct but chilly courtesy. Only Grace, the young maid who had helped her out of her wedding gown that first night, showed anything resembling warmth, though even she was careful never to overstep in front of the other staff. Evelina spent her mornings walking the gardens alone, her afternoons attempting to learn the running of a household far grander than anything she had managed before, and her evenings sitting quietly with a book she rarely managed to read more than a few pages of, her mind too occupied with the strange, cold shape of her new life. 2 weeks into the marriage, an invitation arrived for a garden party hosted by Lady Beatrice Hollowell, one of the most influential women in London society. Julian informed Evelina over breakfast that they would attend together, as a public appearance was expected of them so soon after the wedding. Evelina, though nervous, told herself this would be a chance to prove to society that she was not the scheming, desperate creature the rumors made her out to be. She dressed carefully that afternoon, choosing a pale green gown that Grace assured her brought out the color in her eyes, and arrived at Lady Hollowell's estate on Julian's arm, doing her best to appear calm and composed despite the anxious knot in her stomach. The garden party was beautiful, filled with silk parasols and the soft sound of a string quartet drifting across manicured lawns. For a short while, Evelina allowed herself to hope the day might pass without incident. She was introduced to several guests who greeted her with cautious but civil politeness, and she began to relax, just slightly, as she walked among the flowering hedges with a glass of lemonade in hand. Then she saw Charlotte Whitmore. Charlotte had once been Evelina's closest friend, back when both their families still held respectable positions in society, before the Marsh name became synonymous with scandal and debt. Evelina's face lit with genuine relief at the sight of a familiar friend among so many strangers, and she moved toward her without hesitation. Charlotte's expression, however, remained cool and distant. When Evelina reached her and offered a warm greeting, Charlotte glanced around at the nearby guests before replying, in a voice pitched just loud enough to be overheard, that she was surprised Evelina had the confidence to show her face at a respectable gathering after the way she had trapped a duke into marriage. The words landed like a blow. Several nearby guests turned to look, some hiding smiles behind gloved hands, others simply staring with open curiosity. Evelina felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to remain calm. to say nothing that might give the gathered crowd more to gossip about. She managed a quiet reply, something about hoping Charlotte was well, before excusing herself and walking toward the edge of the garden, her heart pounding. She glanced back once, hoping perhaps that Julian, who stood not far away speaking with a group of gentlemen, might have witnessed the exchange and offered some word of support. He had heard, she was certain of that, given the way his jaw tightened briefly. But he said nothing, did nothing, simply continued his conversation as though the moment had not occurred at all. The sting of his silence hurt almost as much as Charlotte's cruel words. Evelina spent the remainder of the party at the edges of conversations, smiling when required, speaking only when spoken to, counting the minutes until they could politely take their leave. When the carriage finally arrived to take them home, she sat in silence, staring out the window at the passing streets, too proud to let Julian see how deeply the afternoon had wounded her. It was Julian who broke the silence first, which surprised her. He asked, in a careful, measured tone, whether she was well. Evelina considered lying, offering the same polite deflection she had used all day, but exhaustion won out over pride, and she admitted quietly that the garden party had been difficult. Julian was quiet for a long moment before saying that Charlotte Whitmore had once hoped to marry him herself, several years earlier, before circumstances changed and the match fell apart. He said it plainly, without elaboration, but Evelina understood immediately that this explained, at least in part, the venom behind Charlotte's words. It was not simply cruelty, it was jealousy. Evelina absorbed this information silently, turning it over in her mind. It did not erase the sting of humiliation, but it helped her understand it differently. Perhaps not every insult thrown her way in London society had anything to do with her own worth. Perhaps some of it had far more to do with the private histories and disappointments of people she barely knew. That night, after Julian retired to his own chamber, Evelina found herself unable to sleep. She rose quietly and made her way down the corridor toward the library, hoping a book might occupy her restless mind. As she approached the door, she heard voices from within, low and tense. She recognized her husband's voice immediately, along with the sharper, colder tones of the Dowager Duchess. Evelina paused outside the door, knowing she should not listen, yet unable to make herself walk away. Margaret's voice rose slightly as she told her son that this marriage had been a mistake from the very beginning, that he should never have agreed to settle a stranger's debts in exchange for a bride with a ruined name. Julian's reply came low and firm, though Evelina could not make out every word. She caught fragments only, something about honor, and something about a promise made to his late father, and something about there being no other choice given the circumstances of the estate. Evelina stood frozen in the dark hallway, her heart pounding, piecing together a fuller picture of the situation. This marriage, it seemed, had not simply been an act of charity or convenience on Julian's part. There was more to the story, some deeper obligation tied to his father, something Julian had not chosen to share with her. Before she could hear more, footsteps approached the door from within, and Evelina retreated quickly down the corridor, slipping into a shadowed alcove just as the library door opened. She watched from a distance as Julian emerged, his shoulders tense, his expression troubled in a way she had not seen from him before. He did not notice her in the darkness. He simply walked toward his own chamber, his footsteps slow and heavy, a man clearly burdened by something far greater than an unwanted marriage. Evelina returned to her own room that night with more questions than answers. The cold, distant duke she had married was beginning to seem less like a man who simply did not care, and more like a man carrying some private weight she did not yet understand. The following morning, Evelina woke earlier than usual, her mind still turning over the fragments of conversation she had overheard the night before. She dressed quietly and made her way down to the small breakfast room, expecting to eat alone as she often did, only to find Julian, already seated at the table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the window. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Evelina took her seat across from him, unsure whether to mention what she had overheard or to let the matter rest. In the end, curiosity outweighed caution. She asked, carefully, whether something troubled him. Julian's expression flickered with surprise, as though he had not expected her to notice, or perhaps had not expected her to care enough to ask. He was quiet for a long moment before answering that his mother worried a great deal about the estate, and that worry sometimes made her sharp with those she loved. It was not a full answer, and Evelina understood that, but it was more than he had offered her before, and she chose to accept it as a small step rather than press further and risk closing the door he had only barely opened. Grace entered a few minutes later to clear the morning dishes, and Evelina noticed the way the young maid's eyes moved briefly between her and the Duke, as though trying to read the temperature of the room. When Julian excused himself to attend to business in the city, Grace lingered a moment longer than necessary, folding a linen napkin with more care than the task required. Evelina, sensing an opportunity for honest conversation in a house otherwise filled with careful silences, asked Grace gently whether she had always worked at Ashbourne House. Grace explained that she had come into service 3 years earlier, not long after the old Duke had passed away, and that the household had felt different ever since, quieter, heavier, as though something unspoken hung over every room. Evelina asked, as delicately as she could, whether Grace knew anything about the circumstances of the old Duke's death, or the debts and promises that seemed to weigh so heavily on Julian. Grace hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to her position and sympathy for her new mistress, before admitting only that the old Duke had left behind more troubles than the family let show in public, and that Julian had taken on burdens no young man should have to carry alone. It was not much, but it was another small piece of a puzzle Evelina was only beginning to assemble. She thanked Grace for her honesty, and did not press further, sensing the young woman had already said more than she felt entirely comfortable saying. Over the following days, Evelina found herself watching her husband with new eyes. She noticed the way he sometimes paused mid-conversation, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, burdened by matters he shared with no one. She noticed the stack of ledgers and letters that occupied his study late into the evening, far more than seemed necessary for a man of his wealth and position. She noticed, too, the careful, controlled way he interacted with his mother, respectful on the surface but with an unmistakable tension beneath every exchange. She began to wonder whether the cold distance he had shown her since their wedding day was less about indifference toward her specifically, and more about a man who had learned, through whatever difficulties his family had faced, to keep his feelings locked away entirely, from everyone, not just from her. This realization did not erase her loneliness, nor did it excuse the humiliation she had suffered at the garden party while he stood by in silence, but it softened, just slightly, the sharp edge of her resentment, and gave her something she had not expected to find so soon in this marriage: curiosity about the man she had married, rather than simple dread of the years ahead. A few evenings later, Evelina worked up the courage to knock on the door of Julian's study after supper, something she had not done before. He looked up from his papers, clearly surprised by the intrusion, but did not send her away. She asked, without quite knowing what answer she hoped for, whether their marriage might ever become something more than an arrangement of convenience. Julian set down his pen slowly and studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had heard it before. He said he did not know the answer to that question, but that he no longer believed she deserved the cold treatment he had shown her since the wedding, and that he intended to do better, in whatever small ways he could manage. It was not a declaration of affection. It was not even a full apology. But it was honest, and it was more than Evelina had received from him in the 2 weeks since they had married, and she found, to her own surprise, that it was enough to carry her through another quiet night in a house that was slowly, cautiously, beginning to feel just slightly less like a prison, and a little more like a place she might one day call home. She did not know, as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, that this single overheard conversation, and the small, careful honesty that followed it, would mark the beginning of a slow shift in how she saw her husband, and perhaps, in time, how he might come to see her as well. The letter arrived 3 weeks later, sealed with wax and delivered by a footman who would not meet Evelina's eyes. She opened it in the privacy of her chamber, expecting perhaps an invitation, or a note from one of the few acquaintances who had shown her any kindness since the wedding. Instead, the page contained a single cruel line, unsigned, claiming that the new Duchess of Ashbourne had deceived her husband into marriage by falsely claiming to carry his child before the wedding, and that the truth would soon come to light before all of society. Evelina read the words twice, her hands trembling, before the full weight of the accusation settled over her. It was a lie, an obvious and vicious lie, but she understood immediately how dangerous such a rumor could be if it spread unchecked through London's drawing rooms. A woman's reputation, once stained, rarely recovered fully, regardless of the truth. She considered showing the letter to Julian immediately, but hesitated. Their relationship had only just begun to soften in recent weeks, small kindnesses building slowly between them, quiet conversations replacing cold silence. She did not want to disrupt that fragile progress with a scandal that was not even true. Instead, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, hoping foolishly that whoever had sent it would think better of spreading such poison. Her hope did not last. Within days, Evelina began to notice a change in how she was received whenever she left the house. A shopkeeper who had once greeted her warmly now offered only clipped, hurried service. Two women she passed on a walk through the park fell into hushed, urgent conversation the moment they recognized her, their eyes darting toward her middle with obvious curiosity. By the end of the week, the rumor had clearly spread far beyond a single anonymous letter. Evelina finally understood the full scope of the danger when she received an invitation to a ball hosted by Lord and Lady Pemberton, one of the most prestigious events of the season, only to arrive at the door and be met with unmistakable hesitation from the staff managing the guest list. A young footman checked her name against his list twice, glancing nervously toward the ballroom before finally, reluctantly, allowing her and Julian to enter. Inside, the whispers followed her like a shadow. She caught fragments of conversation as she passed groups of guests, phrases about deception, about a supposed lost child, about a woman clever enough to trap a duke through false claims, and then lose the pretense once the wedding was secured. Nobody said the words directly to her face, but she did not need them to. The meaning was clear enough in every sideways glance and hushed exchange. Evelina held her composure through the first hour of the ball, dancing when required, smiling through gritted teeth, refusing to give the gathered crowd the satisfaction of watching her crumble. But when Charlotte Whitmore approached her near the refreshment table, flanked by two other women Evelina did not recognize, the confrontation she had been dreading finally arrived. Charlotte's voice carried just enough to draw attention from nearby guests as she asked, with false sweetness, whether the rumors were true, whether Evelina had indeed lied about carrying a child to force the Duke of Ashbourne into marriage. The question landed like a slap, sharp and public, designed to humiliate rather than to seek any genuine answer. Evelina felt the eyes of the room turn toward her, felt her face flush with anger and shame in equal measure. She opened her mouth to respond, though she barely knew what words might come, when a voice cut through the murmuring crowd from just behind her shoulder. Julian's voice, calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority, informed Charlotte and the assembled guests that the rumor was a fabrication, entirely without truth, and that he found it deeply disappointing that anyone in this room would give credence to anonymous, malicious gossip rather than simple decency toward a woman who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Charlotte's confident expression faltered, her cheeks reddening as several nearby guests exchanged uneasy glances. Julian did not raise his voice, did not make a scene beyond what was necessary, but the firmness in his tone left no room for argument. He offered his arm to Evelina, and together they walked back toward the dance floor, leaving Charlotte and her companions standing in stunned silence behind them. Evelina's heart pounded as they moved through the crowd, not from fear now but from something closer to disbelief. This was the first time since their wedding day that Julian had defended her publicly, without hesitation, without the cold distance that had defined so much of their marriage until now. Later that evening, once the carriage carried them away from the Pemberton estate and back toward Ashbourne House, Evelina finally worked up the courage to ask her husband why he had chosen to speak up so firmly, when he had remained silent during her earlier humiliation at the garden party weeks before. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the passing streets outside the carriage window, before he admitted, in a voice quieter and more open than she had heard from him before, that he had been wrong to remain silent that day. He said he had spent the weeks since turning the memory over in his mind, ashamed of how easily he had let cruelty go unanswered, simply because confronting it publicly felt uncomfortable to him. He said he did not intend to make that same mistake again. Evelina studied his face in the dim light of the carriage, searching for any sign of insincerity, and found none. Whatever walls Julian had built around himself since his father's death, since whatever burdens he carried that she still did not fully understand, something in him had begun, slowly, to shift. She asked, gently, whether he might tell her more about those burdens, about the conversation she had accidentally overheard weeks earlier between him and his mother. Julian's expression grew guarded again, and for a moment Evelina worried she had pushed too far, too quickly. But then he began to speak, haltingly at first, about his father's final years, about debts and poor decisions the old Duke had made that Julian had spent years quietly trying to repair, about a promise made at his father's deathbed to protect the family name and estate no matter the personal cost. He explained finally that the arrangement to marry her had not been simply an act of convenience for her family's benefit. It had also solved a pressing need of his own, a way to secure funds and settle certain obligations without exposing the full extent of his father's mistakes to public scrutiny. He admitted, with visible discomfort, that he had entered the marriage focused entirely on solving a practical problem, without giving proper thought to how his coldness might affect the young woman forced into the arrangement alongside him. It was, Evelina realized, the most honest conversation they had shared since the day they married. She did not know quite what to say in response, so she simply reached across the small space between them and rested her hand gently over his. Julian looked down at the gesture with visible surprise, then turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together for the remainder of the carriage ride home. Neither of them spoke again until they reached Ashbourne House, but the silence between them felt entirely different now than it had on their wedding night weeks before. It felt less like distance, and more like the quiet comfort of two people beginning, cautiously, to understand one another. Once inside, Julian walked Evelina to her chamber door, as he always did, but this time he lingered a moment longer than usual. He told her, quietly, that he intended to find out who had sent the anonymous letter and spread the false rumor, and that whoever was responsible would face consequences for their cruelty. Evelina thanked him, grateful not only for the promise itself but for the protective firmness behind it, so different from the distant stranger who had married her weeks earlier. Before he turned to leave, Julian hesitated, his gray eyes studying her face in the dim hallway light with an intensity she had not seen from him before. For a brief moment, Evelina wondered if he might close the small distance between them entirely, but he simply bid her good night, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, and walked back down the corridor toward his own chamber. Evelina closed her door and leaned against it for a long moment, her heart still racing from the events of the evening. The public humiliation at the ball had been frightening, the cruelty of the rumor deeply unjust, but somehow, the night had ended with something she had not expected to find so soon in this marriage of convenience. The first real glimpse of the man beneath the cold, distant Duke, and the first real hope that perhaps this marriage might yet become something more than a business arrangement built on debts and obligation. The following morning, Evelina woke to find a note slipped beneath her door, written in Julian's careful hand, asking her to join him in the study once she had breakfasted. She dressed quickly, curious and a little nervous, and made her way down the corridor with the memory of the previous night still warm in her mind. Julian sat behind his desk when she entered, a small collection of papers spread before him. He explained that he had already sent word to a private investigator, a man he trusted from his years managing the estate's affairs, to determine the source of the anonymous letter. He believed, based on the handwriting and the particular cruelty of the accusation, that whoever had written it knew details of their courtship that only someone close to their social circle could have known. Evelina retrieved the letter from her drawer and brought it to him, watching as he studied the handwriting with a furrowed brow. He mentioned that he intended to compare it against correspondence from several members of their acquaintance, careful not to accuse anyone without proof, but determined nonetheless to uncover the truth. She found herself grateful, not only for his diligence but for the way he included her in the process rather than handling the matter entirely on his own, as she suspected the old, distant version of her husband might have done only weeks earlier. Later that same day, Evelina received an unexpected visit from the Dowager Duchess. Margaret arrived at the door of the morning room with a stiffness that suggested the visit cost her some effort of pride, and asked, without much preamble, whether she might join Evelina for tea. Evelina agreed, cautious but curious, and the two women sat together in a silence that felt, for the first time, less hostile than uncertain. It was Margaret who finally spoke, admitting in a careful, measured tone that she had heard of the previous evening's events at the Pemberton ball, and that she had been wrong to assume the worst of Evelina from the very beginning. She explained, with visible reluctance, that she had spent years watching her son carry burdens no young man should have to bear alone, and that her sharpness toward Evelina had come, in part, from fear that another complication, another obligation, might break him entirely. Evelina listened carefully, surprised by the vulnerability behind the dowager's usually cold exterior. She said, gently, that she understood a mother's protective instincts, even if the manner of that protection had wounded her deeply in recent weeks. Margaret nodded, accepting the observation without argument, and the two women sat for a while longer, discussing lighter matters, the garden, the household accounts, small ordinary things that felt, after weeks of hostility, remarkably like the beginning of peace. It was not friendship yet, not fully, but it was a start, and Evelina left the conversation feeling lighter than she had in weeks, as though one more wall in this cold, guarded house had begun, slowly, to come down. 3 days later, Julian's investigator returned with findings that confirmed what Evelina had already begun to suspect. The handwriting on the anonymous letter matched, with reasonable certainty, a note previously sent by Charlotte Whitmore to another member of their social circle. a note the investigator had obtained through careful, discreet inquiry. Julian shared the findings with Evelina privately, his expression grim, clearly troubled by the confirmation of a woman he had once considered a family friend behaving with such calculated cruelty. He asked Evelina how she wished to proceed, whether she wanted him to confront Charlotte directly or to handle the matter more quietly through other channels. Evelina considered the question carefully. Part of her wanted immediate, public justice, a chance to watch Charlotte face the same humiliation she had inflicted so casually. But a larger part of her recognized that acting rashly might only invite further scandal, further gossip, further damage to a reputation already fragile from weeks of public scrutiny. She suggested, instead, that Julian speak with Charlotte privately, making clear that they knew the truth and that any further attempts to spread false rumors would be met with consequences severe enough to end her standing in society entirely. Julian agreed, clearly relieved that Evelina had chosen restraint over public confrontation, though he assured her that he intended to make his warning to Charlotte unmistakably firm. That evening, after Julian returned from the difficult conversation with Charlotte, he found Evelina in the small library, curled into a chair near the fire with a book open but unread in her lap. He recounted the confrontation briefly, explaining that Charlotte had denied nothing once presented with the evidence, and had grown pale with the realization that her cruelty had very nearly cost her a place in society entirely. She had promised, tearfully, that she would spread no further rumors, though Julian admitted he placed little trust in the sincerity of that promise given her history. Evelina thanked him quietly for handling the matter with such care, and Julian, instead of offering his usual formal nod and departure, sat down in the chair beside hers, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. They talked for a long while that evening, longer than they had spoken since the day they married, about small things at first, her childhood memories of her mother, his early years learning to manage the estate under his father's demanding expectations, and slowly, gradually, about larger things too, about loneliness, about duty, about the strange, unexpected comfort of finding an unlikely ally in a marriage neither of them had chosen freely. When Evelina finally rose to retire for the night, Julian walked her to her door once more, as had become their quiet habit. But this time, before she stepped inside, he reached for her hand and pressed a light, careful kiss against her knuckles, his gray eyes holding hers with a warmth she had never seen from him before. He said nothing more, simply released her hand and bid her good night. But Evelina stood in the doorway long after he had gone, her heart racing, the memory of that small, gentle gesture lingering far longer than the kiss itself had lasted. Long after the house had gone quiet, Evelina lay awake in her chamber, replaying the small kiss upon her hand again and again in her mind, turning it over the way one turns over a rare, unexpected gift, unsure yet what to make of it, but unwilling to let the memory fade too quickly. Weeks earlier she had lain in this same bed convinced that her marriage would remain forever cold, a business arrangement dressed in the trappings of matrimony. Tonight, for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine something different, something warmer, waiting somewhere ahead of her, if only she and Julian continued walking toward each other, with the same careful courage they had shown tonight. She thought too of Margaret's unexpected softness that afternoon, of the quiet understanding that had passed between them over tea, and wondered whether the whole of Ashbourne House might slowly be shifting around her, wall by wall, room by room, from a place of cold suspicion into something that might one day, however improbably, feel like family. She did not yet know who else might still whisper cruel rumors behind her back, or what further challenges the coming weeks might bring. But she suspected, with growing certainty and a fragile, hopeful warmth she had not expected to feel so soon in this marriage of convenience, that Charlotte Whitmore's jealousy, however dangerous, had inadvertently pushed her and Julian closer together than either of them might have managed on their own, and that the true battle for her place in this marriage, and in society's opinion, had only just begun. Spring arrived at Ashbourne House with unexpected warmth, and so, it seemed, did something new between Evelina and her husband. In the weeks following the confrontation with Charlotte Whitmore, the careful distance that had once defined their marriage began to soften into something gentler. Julian no longer disappeared entirely into his study each evening. Instead, he began joining Evelina in the small library after supper, sometimes reading quietly beside her, sometimes drawn into conversation that stretched long past the hour either of them intended to retire. Evelina found herself looking forward to these evenings with an eagerness that surprised her. She had entered this marriage expecting nothing but cold obligation, and instead found herself slowly, carefully falling into something that felt dangerously close to genuine affection. She reminded herself often not to hope for too much, too quickly, wary of setting herself up for disappointment. But it grew harder each day to guard her heart against a man who had begun, in his own quiet way, to show her real kindness. One bright afternoon, Julian surprised her with an invitation to walk the estate gardens together, something he had never suggested before. Evelina agreed eagerly, curious what had prompted the unusual gesture. They walked slowly along the winding paths, past blooming rows of early roses and neatly trimmed hedges, the spring sun warm against their shoulders. It was during this walk that Julian finally opened up more fully about his father, sharing details he had only hinted at before. He explained that his father had been a proud man, respected publicly but privately reckless with the estate's finances, making poor investments and hiding mounting debts behind a carefully maintained appearance of wealth and stability. By the time Julian inherited the title, he had also inherited a mountain of quiet financial trouble that threatened to destroy everything his family had built across generations. He told her, his voice low and steady, that marrying her had solved two problems at once: settling her father's public debts in exchange for funds that allowed him to address his own family's hidden crisis, without exposing the full extent of it to society. He admitted, with visible discomfort, that this practical calculation had shaped his cold behavior in the earliest weeks of their marriage, that he had approached the entire arrangement as a transaction to be managed rather than a life to be shared with another person. Evelina listened without interrupting, grateful for his honesty even as it explained, painfully, the distance she had endured in those first difficult weeks. When he finished speaking, she reached for his hand, an easy, natural gesture now after the small intimacies they had shared in recent weeks, and told him gently that she understood the weight of protecting a family's name, having carried something similar herself through her father's disgrace. Julian turned to look at her then, his gray eyes softer than she had ever seen them, and said quietly that he was grateful, more than he knew how to properly express, that circumstances had brought her into his life, even under such difficult terms. Evelina's heart raced at the words, simple as they were, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply standing together among the roses, the space between them growing smaller by the second. He reached up, slowly, and brushed a loose strand of hair back from her face, his fingers lingering gently against her cheek. Evelina held perfectly still, scarcely daring to breathe, certain that he meant to close the last small distance between them entirely. But before either of them could move further, the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path broke the moment, and they stepped apart just as a breathless footman arrived to inform Julian that an urgent letter had arrived requiring his immediate attention. Julian excused himself reluctantly, his expression apologetic, and hurried back toward the house, leaving Evelina alone among the roses, her heart still pounding from the almost kiss and the sudden interruption that had denied them both. She spent the remainder of the afternoon in a strange, restless mood, replaying the moment in the garden again and again, wondering what might have happened if the footman had arrived even a minute later. She told herself not to read too much into it, that a single tender gesture did not undo weeks of careful caution, but her heart refused entirely to listen to reason. That evening, Julian did not appear for supper, still occupied with whatever urgent business the letter had demanded. Evelina ate alone in the large dining room, the empty chair across from her feeling more conspicuous than it ever had in the early days of their marriage, when his absence had felt expected rather than disappointing. It was well past midnight when she finally heard his footsteps in the corridor outside her chamber. She had not yet fallen asleep, too restless to settle her thoughts, and she rose quietly to open her door when she heard him pause outside. Julian stood in the dim hallway, his cravat loosened, his expression tired but softened at the sight of her. He apologized for missing supper, explaining briefly that the letter had concerned a business matter requiring immediate correspondence, though he did not elaborate further, and Evelina did not press him. Instead, she simply asked if he was well, and something in her genuine concern seemed to ease the tension from his shoulders. They stood together in the quiet hallway for a long moment, the interrupted intimacy of the garden hanging unspoken between them. Finally, Julian reached for her hand again, holding it gently between both of his, and told her, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he found himself thinking of her far more often than a man in a marriage of convenience had any right to think of his wife. Evelina's breath caught at the confession. She admitted, just as quietly, that she felt the same, that the cold stranger she had married weeks earlier had slowly become someone she looked forward to seeing each day, someone whose good opinion mattered to her, far more than she had expected it ever would. For a moment it seemed the almost kiss from the garden might finally find its completion in the quiet privacy of the hallway. Julian leaned closer, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips, and Evelina felt her own heart racing in anticipation. But he stopped himself just short, taking a small step back instead, and told her softly that he wanted their first true kiss to happen when the timing was right, not rushed in a dim hallway after a long, exhausting day. Evelina, though disappointed, understood, and even admired the restraint, recognizing in it a kind of respect she had not expected from the cold, distant man she married. He bid her good night, pressing another gentle kiss to her hand before turning down the corridor toward his own chamber, and Evelina returned to her bed that night with her heart lighter and fuller than it had been in all the weeks since her wedding day. She did not yet know that even as their marriage grew warmer, someone else was watching their happiness with growing resentment. Charlotte Whitmore, humiliated and warned into silence weeks earlier, had not forgotten the sting of Julian's public defense of his wife, nor the private confrontation that had exposed her cruelty. And she had simply grown quieter, more careful, biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to strike again, in a manner that would leave no trace back to her, and cause damage far greater than any anonymous letter ever could. In a drawing room across London, Charlotte sat with a trusted friend, sipping tea with a calculating look in her eyes, already turning over the beginnings of a plan far more dangerous than the rumor that had failed her before. This time, she told her companion quietly, she intended to make certain the humiliation could not simply be denied or defended away. This time, she would strike where Evelina and Julian would be most publicly exposed, most unable to escape the consequences, at an event so prominent that all of society would witness the fall together. The days that followed brought a steady stream of small, quiet happiness that Evelina had never dared to expect from a marriage born of debt and desperation. Julian began seeking her out even when no urgent matter demanded it, appearing in the library not because a letter required her attention but simply because, he admitted once with a faint, almost boyish smile, he preferred her company to an empty room. He asked her opinion on estate matters she had never expected a duke to consult his wife about, and listened, genuinely listened, when she offered her thoughts on managing the household accounts or arranging the tenant harvest festival that would take place at the end of summer. One afternoon, Evelina asked him, half in jest, whether he had always been so guarded before their marriage, or whether the coldness she first encountered had been reserved especially for her. Julian considered the question seriously, his expression thoughtful, before admitting that he had grown careful with his feelings long before she ever entered his life. He explained that his father, despite his failures with money, had been a warm and affectionate man in his final years, and that watching him decline, weighed down by shame over the debts he could not bring himself to confess even to his own family, had taught Julian a hard lesson about the danger of letting others see too much vulnerability. He said that he had promised himself, standing at his father's graveside, that he would never allow the estate or his family name to fall into such quiet ruin again, and that in pursuing that promise so single-mindedly, he had perhaps forgotten how to let anyone close enough to matter. Evelina, moved by the confession, told him gently that protecting an estate and protecting one's heart were not the same task, and that he need not sacrifice the second in service of the first. Julian studied her for a long moment after she spoke, something unreadable and tender in his expression, before admitting quietly that she was likely the first person in years to tell him something so simple and so clearly true. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the household. Grace, delivering morning tea one day, could not quite hide her smile when she found the Duke and Duchess seated together at the breakfast table, their heads bent close over a shared newspaper, laughing softly at some small joke between them. Even Margaret, still cautious in her newfound warmth toward Evelina, remarked one afternoon over tea that she had not seen her son smile so freely since he was a boy, long before the burdens of the title had settled so heavily upon his shoulders. Evelina cherished these small observations more than she expected to, each one a quiet confirmation that the marriage she had once dreaded as a life sentence of loneliness was slowly transforming into something she genuinely wanted to protect and nurture. She began, cautiously, to allow herself to imagine a future within these walls that did not feel like a punishment, a future that might one day include real affection, perhaps even children who would grow up knowing warmth in this grand, once cold house, rather than the distant formality she had first encountered on her wedding day. It was against this backdrop of quiet, hopeful happiness that the garden walk took place, and it was this same fragile, growing warmth that made the almost kiss beneath the rose hedges, and the near completion of it later in the darkened hallway, feel like such a significant turning point to Evelina. She had stopped bracing herself each day for cruelty and coldness, and had instead begun, slowly, to look forward to whatever small kindness the day might bring from her husband. She did not yet know that even as their marriage grew warmer, someone else was watching their happiness with growing resentment. Charlotte Whitmore, humiliated and warned into silence weeks earlier, had not forgotten the sting of Julian's public defense of his wife, nor the private confrontation that had exposed her cruelty. She had simply grown quieter, more careful, biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to strike again in a manner that would leave no trace back to her, and cause damage far greater than any anonymous letter ever could. In a drawing room across London, Charlotte sat with a trusted friend, sipping tea with a calculating look in her eyes, already turning over the beginnings of a plan far more dangerous than the rumor that had failed her before. This time, she told her companion quietly, she intended to make certain the humiliation could not simply be denied or defended away. This time, she would strike where Evelina and Julian would be most publicly exposed, most unable to escape the consequences, at an event so prominent that all of society would witness the fall together. Charlotte's companion, a sharp-eyed widow named Louisa Price who had her own reasons for resenting the sudden rise in Evelina's fortunes, listened with obvious interest, offering suggestions of her own. Between them, the two women began sketching the outline of a scheme that would rely not on rumor alone, but on forged evidence, something concrete enough that even Julian's growing devotion to his wife could not simply explain away with a firm word and a protective glance. Louisa mentioned an acquaintance skilled with a pen, capable of producing a convincing forgery, and Charlotte's eyes lit with cold satisfaction at the suggestion. Evelina, unaware of the storm quietly gathering against her, spent the following days in a state of cautious happiness, treasuring every small moment of warmth from her husband, unaware that the peace she had finally begun to find within the walls of Ashbourne House was about to be tested more severely than anything she had yet endured. The invitation to the Ashworth family's annual summer ball, hosted at Ashbourne House itself this year in honor of Julian and Evelina's marriage, arrived with all the grandeur society expected of the season's most anticipated event. Evelina had spent weeks helping plan the evening alongside Margaret, the two women working together with an ease that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Together they selected flowers for the ballroom, approved menus with the household cook, and arranged for a small orchestra to provide music late into the night. For the first time since her wedding, Evelina found herself genuinely looking forward to a society event rather than dreading it. Julian, too, seemed lighter in the days leading up to the ball, his usual reserve softened by an ease that had grown steadily between them since the almost kiss in the garden weeks earlier. He had not yet found the right moment for that first true kiss he had promised her, but Evelina sensed, in the warmth of his glances and the increasing frequency of small, affectionate touches, that the moment was drawing closer, and she found herself hoping, with a hope she no longer bothered to guard carefully, that the ball itself might finally provide the occasion. She had no way of knowing that Charlotte Whitmore and her companion Louisa Price had spent those same weeks perfecting a scheme designed to destroy that very happiness before it could fully bloom. The evening of the ball arrived warm and clear, the gardens of Ashbourne House lit with strings of soft lanterns, the ballroom filled with the finest members of London society, all eager to witness the continuing story of the Duke and the Duchess whose marriage of convenience had, according to the more generous rumors now circulating, blossomed into something resembling genuine affection. Evelina wore a gown of deep blue silk, chosen carefully to complement the sapphire pendant Julian had gifted her only days earlier, the first piece of jewelry he had ever given her that was not simply expected of a duchess but chosen, he told her, because the color reminded him of her eyes. She descended the grand staircase that evening to find him waiting at the bottom, his expression unmistakably admiring, and for a moment, surrounded by the glow of lantern light and the soft murmur of arriving guests, Evelina allowed herself to feel, fully and without reservation, that she belonged exactly where she stood. The first hours of the ball passed beautifully. Evelina danced with Julian twice, an unusual public display of affection between spouses that did not go unnoticed by the watching crowd, and spent the remaining time greeting guests with a confidence she had not possessed months earlier, no longer the frightened, humiliated bride of her wedding day, but a duchess secure enough in her position to hold her own amid the glittering crowd. Between dances, Evelina found a quiet moment with Margaret near the edge of the ballroom, the two women watching the swirl of guests with matching expressions of quiet satisfaction. Margaret remarked, with a warmth that would have seemed impossible only months earlier, that she had never seen Julian look so at ease in a crowded room, that even as a boy he had preferred solitude to gatherings such as this, and that whatever change had come over him in recent months, she suspected Evelina bore full responsibility for it. Evelina flushed at the compliment, unused still to such open kindness from the Dowager Duchess, and thanked her, admitting quietly that she had never expected to find such genuine happiness within a marriage that had begun under such painful, public circumstances. She thought, watching Julian speak easily with a group of gentlemen across the room, of how far they had traveled together since that cold, silent wedding night months earlier, when he could barely bring himself to walk her fully to her chamber door. The distant stranger she had married had slowly revealed himself to be a man of quiet depth and surprising tenderness, burdened by responsibilities he had carried alone for far too long, and she felt a fierce, protective gladness at having been given the chance to ease even a small portion of that burden. Her thoughts were interrupted by Grace, who approached briefly to inform her that the refreshment tables required attention, a small household matter that nonetheless pulled Evelina's focus away from the growing warmth of the evening and back toward her duties as hostess. She excused herself from Margaret's company and moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasant greetings with guests along the way, many of whom now offered genuine warmth rather than the cautious civility she had grown accustomed to in the earliest months of her marriage. It was near midnight, as the orchestra paused between sets and guests gathered near the refreshment tables, that Charlotte Whitmore made her move. She approached the center of the ballroom with a small cluster of guests trailing curiously behind her, drawn by the deliberate, purposeful way she carried a folded document in her gloved hand. She raised her voice, loud enough to carry across the hall, and announced that she had come into possession of a letter, one that revealed the truth behind the hurried, convenient marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne. The room fell into stunned silence. Evelina felt her stomach drop even before Charlotte began reading, some instinct warning her that whatever came next would be devastating regardless of its truth. Charlotte unfolded the document with theatrical care and began to read aloud, her voice ringing clearly through the hushed ballroom. A forged letter supposedly written months earlier by Evelina's own hand, addressed to an unnamed confidant, boasting of a deliberate scheme to seduce the Duke of Ashbourne and secure his fortune through calculated manipulation, describing her father's debts as merely a convenient excuse rather than the true circumstance behind the marriage. The forgery was skillfully done, close enough to Evelina's actual handwriting to lend it a horrifying credibility to those unfamiliar with the details of the real courtship. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispers erupted immediately, guests turning to stare at Evelina with expressions ranging from shock to open condemnation. Evelina stood frozen, her mind racing, unable to form words fast enough to counter the accusation before it had already begun to spread through the room like wildfire. She looked desperately toward Julian, who stood only a few feet away, his face pale with fury and disbelief. As he processed the forged document, Charlotte continued to wave for all to see. For one terrifying moment, Evelina feared he might believe it, that months of careful trust and growing affection might crumble instantly beneath the weight of such a public, convincing accusation. Instead, Julian's expression hardened into something Evelina had never seen from him before, a controlled, furious determination that seemed to fill the entire room with its intensity. He crossed the distance to Charlotte in a few swift strides and demanded, in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the ballroom, to examine the letter himself. Charlotte, visibly startled by the directness of his approach, hesitated before handing over the document. Julian studied it for only a moment before declaring, loudly enough for the entire assembly to hear, that the handwriting, while a skilled imitation, contained several inconsistencies that no one intimately familiar with his wife's actual correspondence could possibly miss. Small differences in the formation of certain letters that Evelina herself had never made in any note or letter he had received from her throughout their courtship and marriage. He turned to face the gathered crowd directly, holding the forged letter aloft, and announced that this was not the first attempt to damage his wife's reputation through cruel and calculated lies. He reminded the assembly of the earlier rumor spread weeks before, the false claim about a fabricated pregnancy, and stated plainly that he had since traced that rumor's origin directly back to Charlotte Whitmore herself, a fact he had until now kept private out of a desire to avoid further public scandal. Charlotte's face drained of color as murmurs of shock rippled anew through the crowd, this time directed squarely at her rather than at Evelina. Julian continued, his voice steady and unrelenting, explaining that Charlotte's jealousy over a courtship that had ended years earlier, long before he ever met Evelina, had apparently driven her to increasingly desperate and dishonest measures to destroy a marriage that had done her no harm whatsoever. Louisa Price, standing nearby and visibly panicking as the scheme unraveled before the entire gathered assembly, attempted to slip quietly toward the door, only to find her path blocked by several curious guests, eager to witness how the dramatic scene would conclude. Evelina, still reeling from the shock of the public accusation but steadied now by Julian's unwavering defense, found her voice at last. She stepped forward to stand beside her husband and addressed the crowd directly, her tone calm despite the trembling she still felt beneath the surface. She stated plainly that she had married Julian under circumstances neither of them had chosen freely, born of her father's debts and difficult family circumstances that she had never once tried to hide from society. She said that whatever anyone believed about the origins of her marriage, the accusations Charlotte had just read aloud were fabrications, cruel and calculated, designed to destroy a happiness that had grown, honestly and gradually, between two people who had been given no choice in how their union began, but every choice in how they continued forward together. The ballroom remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking, the weight of her composed, honest words settling over the crowd. Then, slowly, a ripple of quiet murmurs began, no longer directed with suspicion toward Evelina, but with growing sympathy, and no small amount of scorn directed instead toward Charlotte, who stood exposed and humiliated, in the center of the very room where she had hoped to destroy her rival entirely. Margaret, who had been standing near the edge of the gathered crowd throughout the entire confrontation, stepped forward at last and placed a firm, supportive hand on Evelina's shoulder, a public gesture of solidarity from the Dowager Duchess that carried its own unmistakable weight among the watching guests. It was, Evelina realized with quiet astonishment, the clearest sign yet that she had truly found a place within this family, not merely tolerated, but genuinely accepted. Charlotte, recognizing the complete collapse of her scheme and the ruin of her own reputation unfolding before the entire assembly, fled the ballroom in tears, Louisa hurrying after her, leaving behind a stunned silence that gradually gave way to a low, uncertain murmur as guests began processing everything they had just witnessed. Julian turned to Evelina then, his expression softening from the controlled fury of moments before into something far gentler, far more open than she had ever seen from him in public. He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and emotion, and told her, quietly but with unmistakable conviction, that he had never been more certain of anything than he was in this moment, that whatever doubts had once shaped their careful, convenient beginning had long since been replaced by something he could only describe as genuine, deepening love. Evelina's breath caught at the words, spoken so openly, so publicly, in front of the very crowd that had nearly destroyed her reputation only minutes before. She searched his face, certain she must have misheard him, but found only sincerity in his gray eyes, steady and unwavering despite the hundreds of watching guests surrounding them. Before either of them could say more, however, a commotion near the ballroom entrance drew the attention of the crowd away from the couple. A footman hurried through the parting guests, his face pale, carrying a second, sealed letter that he explained had been discovered only moments earlier, delivered by an unknown messenger, and addressed directly to Lord Pemberton, one of the most respected men in the room, and a close friend of Julian's late father. The letter, the footman explained nervously, claimed to contain further proof regarding the true nature of the Ashworth marriage, proof that Charlotte Whitmore herself had insisted, before fleeing the ballroom in tears, would vindicate everything she had said. A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Lord Pemberton, a stern, dignified man not easily swayed by gossip, broke the seal and began reading the contents silently, his expression growing increasingly troubled as his eyes moved down the page. When he finished, he looked up, his gaze moving slowly between Julian and Evelina, and announced, in a grave voice that silenced the room instantly, that the letter contained claims serious enough that he felt obligated, out of respect for the Ashworth family name and the integrity of the gathering, to request that the matter be examined further before the evening concluded. Evelina felt the warmth of the moment before shatter instantly into cold dread. Whatever fragile victory they had won, only minutes earlier now hung suspended, uncertain, as the entire ballroom waited to see what fresh accusation might yet threaten to unravel everything she and Julian had only just begun to build. Julian's hand tightened around hers, his jaw set with the same fierce determination she had witnessed when he first confronted Charlotte. But Evelina could see, beneath that determination, a flicker of genuine uncertainty as well, the first she had seen from him since the confrontation began. Whatever this second letter contained, it was clear from Lord Pemberton's grave expression that the danger to their marriage, and their reputation, was far from over. The orchestra, uncertain whether to resume playing amid such evident tension, fell silent once more, leaving the ballroom suspended in an uneasy quiet as Lord Pemberton folded the letter carefully and requested, with the calm authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, that Julian and Evelina join him privately to discuss its contents before any further public statement was made. As they crossed the ballroom, Evelina caught sight of Margaret standing near the drawing-room door, her expression tight with worry, but her eyes steady, offering silent encouragement as her son and daughter-in-law passed. Evelina drew strength from that small, unspoken support, reminding herself that whatever waited inside the drawing room, she no longer faced these battles entirely alone, as she had on her wedding night months earlier. The murmur of the crowd followed them even as the drawing-room door closed behind them, muffled but unmistakable, 100 voices speculating on what fresh scandal the second letter might reveal. Evelina glanced at Julian as they took their seats before Lord Pemberton's imposing desk, and found him watching her with an expression that held more reassurance than doubt, despite the uncertainty of the moment. He reached over and took her hand once more beneath the desk, out of Lord Pemberton's immediate view, a small, private gesture of solidarity that steadied her nerves considerably as the older man cleared his throat and prepared to explain the contents of the letter in full. Lord Pemberton was not a man given to dramatics, and his measured, careful tone as he began speaking only heightened the tension in the room rather than easing it. He explained that the letter claimed to contain testimony from a former servant of the Marsh household, someone who alleged direct knowledge of a scheme, orchestrated before the wedding, in which Evelina had supposedly manipulated circumstances to ensure Julian's attention and eventual proposal, painting the entire courtship as a calculated performance, rather than the desperate, practical arrangement it had actually been. Evelina felt her stomach tighten at the accusation, absurd as it was, recognizing immediately how convincingly such a claim, delivered through the testimony of a supposed servant rather than an obvious rival like Charlotte, might sway even reasonable minds within London society. She opened her mouth to protest, but Julian spoke first, his voice calm but edged with the same controlled authority he had shown in the ballroom moments earlier, asking Lord Pemberton directly for the name of this supposed former servant, so that the claim might be properly investigated rather than accepted on the word of an anonymous letter alone. Lord Pemberton admitted, after a pause, that the letter provided no name, only vague assurances that such a witness existed and could be produced if necessary. Julian's expression hardened further at this admission, and he pointed out, with the same firm logic he had used to expose the forged handwriting earlier that evening, that an accusation without a named witness, arriving suspiciously within minutes of Charlotte Whitmore's public humiliation and hasty departure, bore all the hallmarks of a final, desperate attempt to salvage her collapsing scheme, rather than any genuine testimony. Lord Pemberton considered this argument carefully, his stern expression softening slightly as the logic of it settled over him. He admitted that he had perhaps allowed the drama of the evening to cloud his usual careful judgment, and that an anonymous, unnamed accusation delivered under such suspicious timing deserved considerably more skepticism than he had initially afforded it. Still, he cautioned that the damage of public speculation, once begun, could not be entirely undone by private reassurance alone, and suggested that some further public statement might be necessary to settle the matter fully in the eyes of the assembled guests. Julian rose from his chair before Lord Pemberton had even finished suggesting the need for a public statement, his decision clearly already made. He said that he had no intention of letting his wife's reputation remain suspended in doubt for even a moment longer than necessary, that the assembled guests deserved the full truth, delivered plainly and without further delay, rather than another round of whispered speculation while they waited for some vague, unnamed witness to be produced. Lord Pemberton, still processing the firmness of Julian's resolve, nodded slowly, and agreed to accompany them back into the ballroom to lend his own considerable authority to whatever statement Julian intended to make. Evelina rose beside her husband, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. Whatever happened next, she was finished cowering from cruel rumors and anonymous accusations. She had spent her wedding day enduring public humiliation in silence, and she had no intention of enduring this final, desperate attack the same way. The drawing-room door opened, and the three of them stepped back into the ballroom, where the assembled guests fell into an expectant hush the moment they appeared. Evelina could feel hundreds of eyes upon her as she walked beside Julian toward the center of the room, but for the first time since the confrontation began, she did not feel small beneath that scrutiny. She felt instead the steady strength of the man walking beside her and the fierce, hard-won confidence of a woman who had survived far worse than a roomful of curious stares. Julian stopped at the center of the ballroom, near the very spot where Charlotte had first unveiled her forged letter, and raised his voice to address the entire gathering. He explained, calmly and clearly, the contents of the second letter Lord Pemberton had received, the vague, unnamed accusation of a supposed former servant, and stated plainly his belief that the letter represented nothing more than a final, cowardly attempt by Charlotte Whitmore to salvage a scheme that had already collapsed under the weight of its own dishonesty. He continued, his voice growing firmer with each word, reminding the assembled guests of everything they had witnessed that evening. The forged handwriting exposed for its inconsistencies, the earlier rumor traced directly back to Charlotte's own hand, and now this final, unsubstantiated accusation arriving with suspicious convenience, mere minutes after her public humiliation and hasty flight from the ballroom. He asked the guests, plainly, whether they found it more likely that his wife, a woman who had endured months of public scrutiny with quiet dignity, had orchestrated an elaborate scheme against him, or that a jealous woman, spurned years earlier and unable to accept his happiness, had resorted to increasingly desperate lies in an attempt to destroy a marriage that threatened her own wounded pride. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, guests nodding to one another as the logic of his argument settled over the room. Several of the more respected members of society, men and women whose opinions carried considerable weight, voiced their agreement openly, declaring the entire affair a disgraceful attempt at character assassination that reflected far worse on its author than on its intended victim. Lord Pemberton stepped forward then and added his own voice to the growing consensus, stating publicly that he had reviewed the second letter's claims himself and found them insufficient, unsubstantiated, and clearly timed to exploit confusion rather than reveal genuine truth. His endorsement, given his considerable standing within society, settled whatever remaining doubt might have lingered among the more skeptical guests. Julian turned then to face Evelina directly, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath as he reached for both of her hands, his gray eyes filled with an open tenderness he had never before allowed anyone else to witness. He told her, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent ballroom, that their marriage had begun as an arrangement neither of them had chosen freely, a transaction born of debt and desperate circumstance rather than affection. But he said that somewhere in the months since their wedding day, walking beside her through quiet gardens and long evenings in the library, watching her endure cruelty with unshakable grace and meet kindness with genuine warmth, he had fallen completely, irreversibly in love with the woman standing before him. Evelina felt tears gather in her eyes, tears of joy this time, rather than the humiliation and grief that had marked so much of their early marriage. She told him, her voice trembling slightly but full of unmistakable sincerity, that she had entered this marriage bracing herself for a lifetime of cold loneliness, and had instead found, against every expectation, a partner whose quiet strength and growing tenderness had given her something she had never dared to hope for after her father's disgrace and her own public humiliation. She loved him too, she said, completely and without reservation, and no scheme, no forged letter, no jealous rival could ever change that truth. The ballroom erupted into soft applause and murmurs of approval, the assembled guests, moved by the raw sincerity of the exchange, abandoning whatever remaining skepticism they might have carried into the evening. Margaret, standing near the front of the crowd, pressed a hand to her heart, her eyes bright with unshed tears at witnessing her son's open declaration of love after so many years of careful, guarded distance. And then, before the entire assembly, before every guest who had once whispered cruel rumors or doubted her worth, before the very crowd that had witnessed her humiliation only an hour earlier, Julian Ashworth, Duke of Ashbourne, drew his wife close and kissed her, fully and without hesitation. A kiss that spoke of everything neither of them had been able to say plainly in the early, cold days of their marriage. A kiss that transformed the ballroom's earlier scandal into something the whole of London would remember instead, as the moment a marriage of convenience became a marriage of genuine, undeniable love. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, filling the ballroom with a joy entirely different from the tension and scandal that had gripped it only minutes before. Even guests who had arrived that evening still harboring quiet doubts about the Ashworth marriage found themselves swept up in the sincerity of the moment, applauding not out of polite obligation, but out of genuine delight at witnessing something so rare, a love story that had triumphed openly over cruelty and deception. In the days that followed, news of the ball spread rapidly through London society, though not in the way Charlotte Whitmore had hoped to orchestrate. Instead of scandal and ruin, the story that circulated through drawing rooms and dinner parties told of a duke's fierce public devotion to his wife, and of a duchess who had weathered every cruel attempt to diminish her with unwavering grace and dignity. Charlotte herself, exposed so thoroughly before the entire assembly, found her own social standing severely diminished, her invitations dwindling rapidly as the truth of her jealousy and deception became common knowledge throughout the very circles she had once hoped to command. Evelina, for her part, found herself embraced by society in a manner she had never anticipated on that cold, humiliating wedding day months earlier. Invitations arrived steadily, filled now with genuine warmth rather than cautious curiosity, and she moved through London's social gatherings with a confidence born not of pretense, but of a marriage that had proven itself, publicly and unmistakably, to be built on something far sturdier than convenience alone. Ashbourne House, too, transformed in the months that followed. The cold formality that had once defined its halls gave way gradually to genuine warmth, laughter echoing more frequently through its grand corridors, the household staff no longer treating their duchess with cautious distance, but with the easy affection reserved for a mistress they had come to respect and admire. Grace, promoted eventually to Evelina's personal attendant, often remarked to the other servants that she had never seen a household transform so completely. From the chilly uncertainty of that first wedding night to the warm, settled happiness that now filled every room. Margaret, too, found her relationship with her son and daughter-in-law deepening steadily, the careful tea-time truce of earlier months blossoming into genuine affection. She often joined Evelina and Julian for quiet evenings in the library, the three of them talking long into the night about matters both trivial and profound, a family finally healed from the quiet grief and financial ruin that had shadowed it for years before Evelina's arrival. One evening, many months after the ball, Julian found Evelina in the garden where their almost kiss had first been interrupted, standing among the same roses that had bloomed then and had since grown fuller and more fragrant with the passing season. He came up quietly behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist, and asked if she remembered this very spot. Evelina, leaning back into his embrace with the easy comfort of a woman fully secure in her husband's love, told him she remembered every detail: the warm sun, the interrupted moment, the uncertainty that had followed. Julian turned her gently to face him, his expression soft with the same tenderness that had defined so much of their journey together, and told her that he intended to spend the rest of his life making up for every cold, distant day of their earliest weeks together, ensuring that she never again doubted, even for a moment, how deeply and completely he loved her. Evelina rose onto her toes and kissed him then, unprompted and unhurried, beneath the same roses that had witnessed the beginning of their true courtship months earlier. It was a private moment now, free from the scrutiny and scandal of the ballroom, belonging only to the two of them, a quiet, tender seal on a love story that had begun in public shame and had ended, against every early expectation, in genuine, unshakable happiness. In the weeks immediately following the ball, Julian made good on his promise to hold Charlotte fully accountable for her actions. He met with her family privately, laying out the evidence of the forged letter and the traced origin of the earlier rumor, with such thorough, undeniable clarity that even her own relations could offer no defense on her behalf. Charlotte's father, mortified by his daughter's conduct, arranged for her to spend an extended period away from London, staying with distant relations in the countryside until the worst of the scandal had faded from memory. Louisa Price, her reputation similarly tarnished by association, found her own social invitations dwindling just as rapidly, a quiet but unmistakable consequence of the scheme she had helped orchestrate. Evelina, when she learned of these developments, felt no particular satisfaction in Charlotte's downfall, only a quiet relief that the threat to her marriage and reputation had finally, truly passed. She mentioned as much to Julian one evening, admitting that she found it difficult to feel triumphant over another woman's ruin, even one who had caused her such deliberate harm. Julian, listening thoughtfully, told her that this very capacity for grace, even toward those who had wronged her, was among the many qualities he had come to love most deeply in her. The summer months brought with them the tenant harvest festival Evelina had helped plan earlier in the year, and she approached the event with an eagerness that surprised even herself. She spent long afternoons walking the estate grounds alongside Julian, greeting tenant families by name, listening with genuine interest to their concerns about crops and livestock, and earning, gradually, the same warm respect from the estate's working families that she had slowly won within the walls of Ashbourne House itself. Julian watched her move among the tenants with evident pride, remarking to his mother one evening that Evelina possessed a natural gift for connecting with people from every station, a gift he suspected would serve their family and estate well for many years to come. Margaret, for her part, found herself increasingly drawn into the warmth of her son's transformed household. She began joining Evelina on her garden walks, the two women discussing everything from household matters to the histories of the estate's oldest families. their earlier hostility replaced now by a genuine, comfortable friendship neither had expected to find in the other. Margaret confided one afternoon that she had spent years fearing Julian would never fully recover from the weight of his father's failures, that he would carry that burden alone into a joyless, dutiful adulthood. Watching him now, she said, laughing freely in the garden with his wife, she finally believed her son had found not just a solution to the estate's financial troubles, but genuine happiness as well. Grace, too, found her own position within the household transformed over those months. Recognized for her early kindness and quiet loyalty during Evelina's most difficult weeks as a new bride, she was promoted to serve as Evelina's personal attendant, a role she embraced with evident pride and gratitude. The other household staff, taking their cues from their mistress's genuine warmth, gradually shed the cautious formality that had once defined every interaction within Ashbourne House, replaced instead by an atmosphere of easy respect and quiet affection that permeated every corridor and drawing room. As autumn approached, Evelina discovered she was carrying a child, news that filled both her and Julian with a joy neither had thought possible during those cold, uncertain early weeks of their marriage. Julian, upon hearing the news, wept openly for the first time since Evelina had known him, overwhelmed by the realization that the family he had once feared he could never properly provide for, burdened as he had been by his father's failures and his own guarded heart, was now expanding into something he had genuinely believed himself incapable of building. The news spread quickly through London society, and this time, every response carried nothing but genuine warmth and celebration, a stark contrast to the cold whispers and cruel rumors that had greeted their wedding announcement less than a year earlier. Invitations poured in for celebratory gatherings, and even those guests who had once doubted the sincerity of their union now spoke openly of the Ashworth marriage as one of the great love stories of the season, a transformation Evelina still found remarkable each time she encountered it. One evening, many months after the ball, Julian found Evelina in the garden where their almost kiss had first been interrupted, standing among the same roses that had bloomed then and had since grown fuller and more fragrant with the passing season. He came up quietly behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist, and asked if she remembered this very spot. Evelina, leaning back into his embrace with the easy comfort of a woman fully secure in her husband's love, told him she remembered every detail: the warm sun, the interrupted moment, the uncertainty that had followed. Julian turned her gently to face him, his expression soft with the same tenderness that had defined so much of their journey together, and told her that he intended to spend the rest of his life making up for every cold, distant day of their earliest weeks together, ensuring that she never again doubted, even for a moment, how deeply and completely he loved her. Evelina rose onto her toes and kissed him then, unprompted and unhurried, beneath the same roses that had witnessed the beginning of their true courtship months earlier. It was a private moment now, free from the scrutiny and scandal of the ballroom, belonging only to the two of them, a quiet, tender seal on a love story that had begun in public shame and had ended, against every early expectation, in genuine, unshakable happiness. Their marriage of convenience had become, in the truest and fullest sense, a marriage of love, and the whole of London, once so quick to doubt and mock the union, now spoke of the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne as proof that even the coldest, most unpromising beginnings could grow, with patience and honesty, into something warm enough to last a lifetime. Winter settled over Ashbourne House with a quiet, contented stillness that Evelina had never imagined possible within these walls during her first cold weeks as a bride. She stood now at the same window where she had once watched the dark gardens on her wedding night, feeling nothing but dread for the years ahead. Tonight, heavy with child and wrapped in a warm shawl Julian had insisted she wear against the winter chill, she watched snow fall softly over the same gardens, her heart full instead of hollow, her future no longer a gray, uncertain road, but a warm, settled path she walked gladly beside the man she loved. Julian found her there, as he often did in these quiet evening hours, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin lightly against her shoulder as they watched the snow together in comfortable silence. He asked, as he often did these days, whether she was well, whether the child was resting easily, whether she needed anything at all. Evelina laughed softly and assured him, as she always did, that both she and their unborn child were perfectly content, though she never tired of his careful attention. Their daughter arrived in the early days of spring, born during a gentle rain that Julian later remarked felt fitting somehow, a quiet, steady blessing after the storms they had weathered together in their first year of marriage. They named her Charlotte, a decision that surprised even Margaret, though Evelina explained gently that she wished to reclaim the name from its association with cruelty and jealousy. choosing instead to let it belong to someone who would grow up surrounded by nothing but love and warmth. The household embraced the new arrival with genuine joy. Grace, now trusted completely within the family's inner circle, often held the infant in the nursery while Evelina rested, singing soft, half-remembered songs from her own childhood. Margaret visited daily, doting on her granddaughter with an openness that stood in sharp contrast to the guarded, critical woman Evelina had first encountered in the morning room nearly 2 years earlier. The Dowager Duchess often remarked that she had never expected to find such simple happiness in her later years, watching her son's family grow within the very halls that had once felt so heavy with unspoken grief. Julian proved himself, in those early months of fatherhood, to be every bit as tender and devoted as he had become as a husband. He spent long hours in the nursery despite the many demands of the estate, insisting on learning every detail of his daughter's care, determined that she would grow up knowing nothing but warmth from her father, unlike the distant, dutiful relationship he had endured with his own father in his final troubled years. Evelina often found him there in the evenings, murmuring softly to their daughter as he walked her slowly around the nursery, and she would linger in the doorway simply watching, her heart full nearly to bursting at the sight of the once cold, guarded Duke transformed so completely by fatherhood. News of little Charlotte's birth spread quickly through London society, and once again, the response carried nothing but warmth and celebration. Invitations for christening gifts and social calls arrived steadily, and Evelina found herself, in these gentler months, finally and fully accepted as a beloved member of society, rather than the object of scandal and suspicion she had once been. She often thought back to that first humiliating wedding day, the whispered cruelty, the cold formality, and marveled at how completely her circumstances had transformed in the time since. As the first anniversary of their wedding approached, Julian surprised Evelina with a quiet, private celebration in the very garden where their courtship had truly blossomed months earlier. He had the roses tended with special care for the occasion, and arranged for a small table set beneath the blooming hedges where they had first nearly kissed, candles glowing softly in the evening air despite the season's lingering chill. Over a simple, intimate supper, Julian raised his glass and told Evelina that he wished to properly thank her, not simply for the happiness she had brought into his life, but for the patience and grace she had shown him during those early, difficult weeks when he had treated her with such unforgivable coldness. He admitted that he often thought back to their wedding night, to the careless, distant way he had left her alone at her chamber door, and felt a deep, lasting gratitude that she had chosen, despite every reason to give up on their marriage entirely, to remain open to whatever warmth might eventually grow between them. Evelina reached across the small table and took his hand, telling him gently that she held no resentment for those early weeks, understanding now, as she had not understood then, the full weight of grief and obligation he had carried silently into their marriage. She said that she considered herself fortunate beyond measure to have found, beneath that cold exterior, a man capable of such deep tenderness and devotion, and that she would choose him again, without hesitation, even knowing every difficult moment that had led them to this quiet, contented evening. They sat together beneath the roses long after their supper had finished, talking quietly of the year behind them and the years still ahead, of little Charlotte's future, of the estate's continued recovery from the financial troubles that had once threatened to destroy it, of the family they hoped to continue building together in the seasons to come. Julian mentioned, with quiet amusement, that Lord Pemberton had recently remarked to him that the Ashworth marriage had become something of a favorite topic among London's more sentimental hostesses, held up frequently as proof that even the coldest, most unpromising beginnings could grow into genuine, lasting love. Evelina laughed softly at this, admitting that she still found it strange, at times, to think of her own difficult wedding day being spoken of now with such fondness rather than pity or scorn. Julian squeezed her hand gently and told her that their story deserved to be remembered that way, not for its painful beginning, but for everything they had built together since, patience and honesty slowly transforming obligation into genuine devotion. As the evening grew late and the candles burned low, Julian rose and extended his hand to help Evelina from her chair, suggesting they retire inside before the night's chill grew too sharp for comfort. But before they left the garden, he paused once more beneath the roses, drawing her close for a final, unhurried kiss beneath the darkening sky, echoing the very moment that had first sparked hope between them so many months earlier. They walked back toward the house together afterward, hand in hand, the warm glow of Ashbourne House's windows welcoming them home, no longer the cold, unfamiliar fortress Evelina had first entered as a frightened, humiliated bride, but a true home now, filled with love, laughter, and the quiet, settled happiness neither of them had dared to hope for on that difficult wedding day, nearly 2 years earlier. In the years that followed, the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne welcomed 2 more children into their growing family, and Ashbourne House became known throughout London not for the cold scandal of its beginning, but for the warmth and genuine affection that filled its halls. Margaret lived to see her grandchildren grow, doting on each of them in turn, finally at peace after years of quiet worry over her son's happiness. Grace remained a trusted and beloved member of the household for the rest of her working years, often telling the younger staff, whenever a new bride arrived nervous and uncertain within grand estate walls, that even the coldest beginnings could grow into the warmest endings, if 2 people were willing to be patient, honest, and brave enough to let each other in. Years later, when little Charlotte had grown old enough to ask her mother about the portrait of a stern-faced woman that hung in a rarely visited corridor of Ashbourne House, Evelina told her, gently, an honest but softened version of the story behind it, of a woman named Charlotte Whitmore, who had once let jealousy guide her toward cruelty, and who had, in the end, taught an entire household the importance of choosing honesty and kindness over bitterness, however difficult that choice might sometimes prove. Her daughter listened with wide, curious eyes, and asked whether the woman had ever found happiness of her own. Evelina, who had heard through distant acquaintances that Charlotte had eventually married a quiet country gentleman and settled far from London's judgmental circles, told her daughter that she believed everyone deserved the chance to grow and change, even those who had once caused great harm, and that she hoped, wherever Charlotte now lived, she had found some measure of peace. Julian, listening from the doorway during this conversation, later told Evelina that her willingness to extend such grace, even in memory, was a quality he hoped their children would inherit fully from their mother. He admitted that he himself still felt a flicker of protective anger whenever Charlotte's name arose, a remnant of the fierce, defensive love he had felt for his wife on that dramatic evening in the ballroom years earlier. Evelina simply smiled and told him that his protectiveness, however fierce, had never once made her feel anything but cherished, and that she would not trade a single moment of their difficult beginning, painful as it had been, for a smoother path that might never have taught them to appreciate one another so deeply. The estate itself flourished under their combined stewardship in the years that followed. Julian, freed at last from the secret financial burdens his father had left behind, invested wisely in the tenant farms and local trade, and Ashbourne's fortunes grew steadily stronger with each passing season. Evelina took an active role in managing the household and supporting the tenant families, earning a reputation throughout the county as a duchess who genuinely cared for the well-being of everyone under her family's care, not merely the wealthy guests who filled her ballroom on grand occasions. Their annual summer ball, once the site of such painful public scandal, became instead one of the most anticipated and beloved events of the London season, remembered fondly now as the place where a duke had once declared his love so openly and completely, before an entire assembly of witnesses. Younger couples, navigating their own difficult courtships and arranged matches, often sought Evelina's quiet counsel at these gatherings, and she never failed to offer them the same patient honesty that had carried her through her own uncertain beginning, reminding them that even the coldest starts could warm, given enough patience, honesty, and courage from both sides. On quiet evenings, long after the children had grown and the household had settled into its comfortable rhythms, Julian and Evelina often returned to the same garden where their story had truly begun, sitting together among roses that had bloomed and faded and bloomed again across so many passing seasons. They rarely needed words in these moments, content simply to sit together in the easy, settled silence of 2 people who had built something lasting from the most unpromising of beginnings, grateful, always, for the strange twist of circumstance that had brought them together, and for the patient courage that had allowed them, slowly and honestly, to fall in love.